futures. So for me, I would be successful, especially here we are at the very front end of this conference and a conversation together, to provide a spark for our imaginations, our collective imaginations, to maybe catalyze some connections that may be new in this group of folks who's gathered, and to spark some learning and growth. So opening up maybe new ways of thinking or approaches to this work that I know many of you are deeply engaged in. And we want to also produce some potential insights that would create pathways towards action. So I'll tell you a little bit about how we go about doing that. So the Three Horizons model is a model that I absolutely, oh my goodness, it is such a powerful and extraordinary tool, and it's one that I'm going to introduce you to. This work really is originated from a fellow named Bill Sharp. He's Welsh. He's coordinated with folks all over the world, collaborated with folks at the Institute for the Futures Forum. I got to spend time with him in London last year, and with the folks from an organization called Future Stewards, who are collaborating globally to help think about how to help people think wisely about the future. So this is less of a something that would provide us with answers and more a platform for us to ask smarter questions. And as the economist Kate Raworth says, who's part of this group, disagree better. So let's see what happens and where we go. So I want you to think with me for a little bit about the future. And if we think about this axis of the future, and on the y-axis, we have agency. Agency is our capacity to impact change, possibly, to intervene with our effort and our intention, our systems. And on the x-axis, we have uncertainty. So in a domain where we have maybe, where we're thinking about weather, for example. Weather would be an example of something where we have pretty low agency about it, right? Like I can't control when the snow or this is going to come, or the rain or the sun. But I can pretty predictably use forecasts and predictions from the past to take a guess about what's going to happen tomorrow. There are systems of thinking that invite us into planning and forecasting in this lower left-hand quadrant that are pretty useful for us. Now, if I'm thinking about roadmap, right, my agency might go up. I might have a lower level of uncertainty. This might be like, I'm going to think about how to bring together a plan for my vacations next year. Although this year that would have gotten changed in 2020. But it's like, I have a lot of agency. I have pretty low uncertainty. So I can create some plan or some roadmaps or some pathways. Upper left-hand corner. Over here, if we go out on the x-axis on uncertainty into scenarios, that's when we have questionable or maybe low agency to impact, but we have high levels of uncertainty. So you may have heard about this, or you may have been involved in this, that we may do some scenario planning, 1, 2, or 3 scenarios which could come to pass. The work that we're going to talk about today sits in none of those buckets. Where it sits is in where we have actually high agency, high capacity to create or convene change, but also high levels of uncertainty. And what we know about this domain of complexity is it's less useful to rely on what has been in terms of making plans or forecasts. It's not exactly in the domain of scenario planning, although some scenario planning may be helpful. And roadmaps are ill-suited for this domain. So we need another tool. We need another mechanism to think about in this quadrant. How do we begin to engage? So the Three Horizons model sits in this quadrant, and there's 3 really important curves that define what we want to talk about. So the first one is in the Three Horizons model. It's called H1. And H1 is the curve where this is really business as usual. This would be a description of kind of like the world or the status quo around us right now. And something about the status quo is no longer fit for purpose. The structures, the systems, the cultures, the ways of being and doing are eroding. So the way that we have been engaging, maybe as under large systems of capitalism, for example, the strategic fit with the planet is eroding. That's a great example. Ecologically, we can no longer tolerate the way we've been behaving for a number of decades. So the strategic fit with the current behavior is out of sync with what we need. So H1 we see here in the curve is eroding. The strategic fit is going away. Typically, this is very familiar to us. So most of us can talk about H1 in a sense of, this is the way things work. This is the way the world is. This is the way institutions or governments or systems around us function. So most of us are pretty good at identifying, and we can point out in a lot of ways what is happening with H1. So Kate Raworth talks about this, and she says this is the degenerative and the divisive economy. That's one of the ways that she talks about it. She talks about, this is what's pushing humanity out of the donut, if you know Kate's work. Business as usual. All right. Also happening here at time zero, time is our horizon, is our axis on our x-axis. Also happening here is what's called the visionary view. Pockets of the future, that are happening in the present. Pockets of things that are new ways of doing and being, new systems, new innovations that are actually occurring in real time, but they're not at a system-wide level yet. But we see them. We see them pop up in important ways. We see them happening across maybe in pockets of places where you're involved or you're taking action. So H3, this H3 curve is the future that we'd like to see. It's a transformative shift into a future we would like to have come to pass. But it's not sort of widespread. It's not happening everywhere, but there are pockets where this is occurring. So this would improve and replace H1, but it's not universally sort of adopted or accepted. So it's emergent. Now, Horizon 2 is the really interesting part. Horizon 2 is the transition zone. It's the entrepreneurial place where new ways of being and doing are created. So there's this dynamic space of change where if I'm going to leap from H1, I might get from H2 onto this H3 curve and create it as a way that life looks, right? That becomes a system that's kind of business as usual. So this is the arena of disruptive innovation. Now, let's take a few examples so we can kind of ground this and get our arms around it a little bit more. Here's an example from technology that most of us can understand. So anybody in some point in their life, like me, have a Discman? You can raise your hand. Yeah, Cassidy's already saying yes. I had a Discman. All right, awesome. So many of us, I was a kid in the 80s. Chad had Discman. Discmans were awesome because this was a totally revolutionary technology. What it allowed us to do was to take our music with us, right? And to take CDs. So this was a big deal. It was a really major innovation. However, there were some issues. So if we were going to say that the Discman was H1, there were some issues with it, right? There was issues with the Discman. And Cassidy, maybe are you willing to tell us what would be an example of an issue? Why was the Discman not a perfect tool?
I mean, it's pretty big.
It's pretty big. It's not going to fit in your back pocket. What else?
You have to carry, the CDs with you.
You have to carry your CDs with you. And if you really start rocking out, your CDs are going to skip, right? You can't take it on a run. You can't really rock out with it. So there's some issues with H1. If this is kind of, we're imagining this is that red H1 curve where it was not adequate. It was no longer fit for purpose. So some innovations came along in H2. Now, first, there was the innovation of the Minidisc Player. Some of us don't even want to admit that we jumped on this bandwagon. But the Minidisc Player intended to solve many of the problems Cassidy was just explaining. It was smaller. It didn't skip. There was a few improvements with it. It was like a totally different machine. So this is an example of an H2 innovation to the H1 curve. However, there was also a different innovation. And this innovation is what we're going to term H2 plus. The innovation that actually leapt us forward onto a new curve that was a disruptive technology was the total conversion into the first iPod. This iPod was revolutionary in that it's like you don't have to carry CDs or tapes or anything around. It's not only small and it won't skip, but it's now leaping into a whole different technology where we have downloadable music files, right? So this has led us to our current status, which is H3, which is, that we have streaming virtual music all the time. So, and now, of course, H3 has become H1 because where we have this now is most of us have phones in our pockets. So this is an example of how these curves may work together. All right, so the key question here is, how do disruptive innovations get us from this H1 place, business as usual, to this H3 place? If we think about H1 as business as usual, right, which is the exploitative economy, into a regenerative and distributive economy of H3, how do we make the leap? So one of the ways that we want to think about this is we think about this example, again, a different way of thinking about H1 and H2. So some innovations can extend the life of the degenerative economy by tapping into existent systems. So here we have this example of Uber capitalizing on the handheld app, on a handheld phone, which many of us have in our pockets. Uber, what they did was tap into an exploitative system, right, which has been widely criticized, to tap into and perpetuate the financing and the sort of the way that H1 works from a business perspective. So it's an innovation that H1 captures in order to extend its lifeline. On the other hand, another innovation, this is an app in called Ride Austin, which came out in Austin, which gave direct control over the app, the same technology, but gave it directly to taxi drivers, was designed, funded, and harnessed to vault us towards H3, this new disrupted future, this new normal. So the questions we want to ask ourselves as we think about H3, which is that green line that's emerging, is what is being born and how can we help it to arrive well? This is where you, in just a short minute, are going to get into a breakout group with a few other people from this call and talk about this idea of H3 is what is that green line? What are pockets of things that you are seeing that are arriving into the future? Maybe these are hopeful pockets where you're seeing change get traction, innovative folks doing good work in the domains that you know about. This could be ecologically, this could be in different organizational contexts, this could be social movements. Where is H3 getting traction and how can we help it to arrive well? That's the first question I'd like you to talk about. Talk about H3. Then, this is easier for most of us, what's dying? This H1 system that's no longer fit for purpose, this way of being and doing in the world that is clearly on its way out or needs to be. How can we help let it go and leave well? And then finally, what are some disruptions you're noticing? And how can we harness them to get us into that curve of H3 rather than capture them to perpetuate the old system that's dying out? So what I want to do is just check and make sure that everyone's tracking and clear about what the questions are and what the setup is of your conversation that you get to go have here for a few minutes. If you're not clear, please unmute yourself and raise your hand and say, hey, I don't get it. If you're good to go, we're going to assume that the rest of the group is too. Okay, awesome. So you should have a magical breakout room that is going to pop up for you and invite you into a conversation. Hi, Karen. Thanks for being here. Invite you into a conversation about this. So what is being born in H3? How can we help it arrive well? What is dying and how can we let go of it? And what disruptions are you noticing in your world? Excuse me, in your world and in your context that you can map to this thinking model. Okay.
Yeah, Allie,
Yes.
are we to kind of limit this to more issues around sustainability or just any examples at all that we can come up with?
I think any examples at all that you want to come up with, I would say we're going to give you like probably 6 to 8 minutes to do this quickly. And we want you to just jump right in and do a quick brainstorm. So what's emerging, what's dying, and what are you seeing that's disruptive? Maybe start really simple and easily and take it from there. All right. Hello, everybody. So let's hear a few thoughts of some of the things that came out from your conversation. What are you noticing? Is pockets of things that are in the present that are emerging as by way of H3? What are you noticing?
I can talk. So I had a great group with Casey, Sarah, and Kelly. And Kelly got us started off with kind of the topic of energy and oil, as starting actually with the second question of like, what is dying is kind of our reliance on non-renewable energy. And Casey kind of brought us back to the first question of, what's being born and how can we think innovatively there to address the second question. And Kelly brought up a really good example of like, not necessarily related to renewable energy, but closed loop systems. She gave the example of like a clothing company where you buy their garment, when you're done with it or it's no longer, whatever, it has holes, you send it back to them, you can buy something new at a discounted price and they use your old garment to make more clothes. Casey and I were talking a little bit more about policies and systems of, policies being born that one would hope also include how to let oil and coal die well, so we're not leaving anybody behind. So these systems are equitable from the start, from birth. Okay, so we have a policy, we want to close a coal plant and make more wind energy. I don't know, that's just an example. How do we include everyone in that so no one gets left behind? Because if some people get left behind, it doesn't work. It's not a system that will be sustainable. So we didn't really get into what is being disruptive so much. I think Casey started going there, and I don't know if he went like thinking a little bit more institutionally and with education, but that was what our group talked about.
Thanks so much for kicking us off, Brianna. That is just great. Let's hear from others. What other things popped up? It sounds like quite a lot of rich insight in that short conversation. Good for you guys. Let's hear from others.
I guess I could go for our group. Karen brought up a really good point of education as something that we, at least for like H2, we've just been forced into this new like Zoom platform. And that's definitely shown how potentially, just straight in-person classes where a teacher is reading a lecture, going from a textbook all the time, potentially needs to change. And then I think it was Isabel also brought up a good point of how media nowadays has kind of helped cover some of the subjects that aren't getting taught in the classroom and helping educate people in that way. And we weren't really sure where that's going to go, like what the H3 could be. But yeah, that's kind of what we talked about.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for that. There's been this major disruption this year, and you're getting a thumbs up over down there from Isabel. There's been a major disruption in education this year that's actually in some ways may hasten the decline of some of H1 practices, right? This whole, as you mentioned, kind of the didactic, the teacher talking to the class and we read from the textbook may hasten it. Or certain things may actually, we may kind of, if H1 is still active, grab onto some innovations in order to extend the life. So it remains to be seen, but there are neat innovations happening. Is there anybody who wants to share one more piece that came out of your conversation or something interesting that's percolating from your conversation? Sarah, do you want to chime in?
I was in the group with Brianna talking about, just transitioning to a more green economy, which really brings into question what is dying and how can we let it go and leave well, which I think is just a very important question. If we don't let some things go in a way that agrees with everyone, then some people always hang on to it.
Yeah, Yeah, beautiful. Well, what I want to do is I want to lead us quickly into a little thought experiment. And this is something that's a role play. And it's one of the quickest, most effective ways to get right into the heart of this that I know. So I'm going to invite you to play. And here's an opportunity. Qualities of mind and being that would support us. I would suggest, I love this quotation around having a beginner's mind. So an invitation to just come into this role play with a beginner's mind, and let's see where we go. So here's the setup. You are going to be put into groups of 3, and each of you is the CEO of one of these organizations. So over here, we have Daimler Chrysler, who of course makes Mercedes cars, trucks, and buses. Chrysler has a big market share, a big history, lots of assets, lots of expertise, big global business, lots and lots of tradition. And these are the incumbents, right? This is the kind of dominant incumbent perspective. So this would be H1. H1 is this major global organization, lots of money, the incumbents. H3, if you've not heard of these guys, they're incredible. River Simple is going to take on the visionary perspective. River Simple is a car concept business that crowdsourced the design of a hydrogen fuel cell powered passenger vehicle. And they are produced in micro factories. They're not intended to be owned, but instead accessible for a fee. This company is doing really interesting things, and their intention is to disrupt the entire transportation system into a whole new mobility system. Okay, so H3 is River Simple. And of course, H2, many of us know, is Tesla. So this would be an example of an entrepreneurial leap, which is, combining some new technologies. And they would assert they've got innovation in their automobiles that are much better in all dimensions than what we've had in the past. Okay, so you need to look at these, please, and think about, here's what I'd encourage. If you are typically in the role of the visionary, maybe take the role of the incumbent. Maybe take H1 as your role. If you're typically the one who sort of like stands up for tradition and stability, and you usually would go towards H1, maybe take the role of the entrepreneur. So we're going to put you in groups of 3, and I'm going to ask you to do this. I would like for you to please have a conversation with one another, your fellow leaders. And you're at a conference, your CEOs, you're at a conference, and you're looking for funding. So you've met up in the corner of the room during cocktail hour, and here's the 3 of you together having a conversation and sharing your perspectives on your particular organization. So whether you're Daimler Chrysler, River Simple, or Tesla, you're going to suggest, here's what's happening relative to our future, and here's why we're seeking funding, and here's why we need it. Okay, so you're going to have a conversation, staying in your role if you can, listening to each other in the corner at this cocktail hour. Clarifying questions? Everybody ready to go?
So, Allie, so we're taking the role of one of us will each be one of these different companies.
Yes.
We're seeking funding for our particular company idea.
Yep.
And kind of why we should get funding. Like
you got it.
Our pitches. Okay.
You got it. And you're talking to each other, right, about this. You're going to have 5 or 6 minutes, and that's it. And then we'll come back.
Okay.
Maybe actually 4 minutes. Are we ready, Chad? Almost. Chad says yes. So think about, I'll put the last slide back. Think about which of these you'd like to adopt. Everyone will get to be one, and then we'll see what happens. So I hope you were able to make some traction and do a little bit of playing in your role play. I would love for you to please, we're going to do something that is one of my favorite ways to quickly hear how people are doing or what happened for you, which is a chatterfall. It's one of my favorite Zoom techniques if you've never done it. So please go ahead and open your chat. And just give us, don't push enter till I tell you, please, but just give us a couple words, a couple bullet points. What was that like? What ahas did you have? What occurred to you while you were doing that mini role play? So go ahead and just a couple words into your chat, please. Excellent. So, and when you're ready, if you would please go ahead, 3, 2, 1, and give us a chatterfall. You can push enter. And we can all read what's here. Great. Great. So I'm seeing some things. Hard to challenge the incumbent, hard to come up with good reasons why this is something we should let go of or let die. Maybe some pushback. Is River Simple really H3? Is this as innovative as we think? It's hard to come up with disruptive solutions and change people's mindsets. Yes, indeed. It can be hard to change old habits. So thank you for that. So one of the things I want to introduce, and this is where we're going to close today, is how can we engage one another around these core questions of H1, H2, and H3 in a way that is going to be supportive of moving forward from the incumbent position, opening up these mindsets that may be sort of intractable, and bringing everybody along into the innovations that are going to make a difference. So I want to notice, if you just went through this and had this experience, if you were playing the H1 role, you may have felt this experience of, this is too risky. How could we take that bet? Well, this is irrelevant. We're not going to have some crazy technology in the sky. We're always going to need to rely on the trucks and buses we provide and that reliability. Or you may have been in the H2 zone, which is, God, look at this dinosaur. You are stuck in a different age. You have to die. You have to let go. We've got to move on. Or, well, maybe I have to compromise some with this kind of upstart technology, even though it's not quite as far as I'd like to go. Or in the H2, you may have felt like H3 was just impractical. It's a leap too far in the direction of innovation and disruption. Or H1 is just obstructing you and obstructing your progress. So the invitation for all of us is to come into these horizon positive perspectives with one another. And what that could look like is here. From the H1 perspective, it's like, what if I look towards H3, or we could reconceptualize a mindset of hope or hopefulness into this H3 curve. Rather than threat, I see it as hope. Can H3 really importantly honor the heritage of what H1 has brought? Maybe there's processes, infrastructure, ways of doing things that we could learn from that would be supportive, so we can honor that so people don't get left behind. In the H1 going towards H2, maybe there's some really good revolutionary ideas that we can play with, and we can look to those disruptive innovators for that. From H2, we could look for H1 for support, again, relying on the depth of resources and innovation that's been there. And between H3 and H2, let's create some allyship. Let's harness and leverage this relationship that both of us are committed to moving in the same direction, or maybe take inspiration from one another. So I want to offer this a way to go through the week for everyone, or in the next few days, and maybe some things that you're playing with in your own life. Where do you sit in relationship to innovation? Where do you sit in relationship to disruption? And how might we all be served from thinking about how to let what's no longer fit for purpose die well? What's emergent be supported? And how can we play together in a way that we can collaborate most effectively to bring this new future into being? So I know, almost out of time. We need to move into our next session. But what I would love to do is just ask you briefly to put a few notes into the chat about the following. What sense are you making? What sense are you making here about what we're talking about? So maybe just put a couple last thoughts into the chat, a takeaway, an aha, what's something you're learning, something you're curious to learn more about, leaving from this session by way of close. So if you go ahead and pop it into the chat, we'll all take a moment and look at what is on everyone's mind, and then we'll say goodbye for today.
And as you all are sort of gathering your thoughts, I will go ahead and thank Allie so much for kicking off our conference. Thank you all so much for coming and participating so fully and thoughtfully. We are moving right along to a lot of excellent panels the rest of today. Join us in 5 minutes if you would like. We will be talking about how to support environmental justice for BIPOC communities. We will be talking about breaking free from plastics, giving some updates on some cool things happening around campus, and closing out with a workshop about how to do teen science, again, to support communities of color. So do feel free to join us through the rest of the day. Tomorrow we've got a whole new slate of fantastic speakers, and thank you all so much.
Take care, everyone. Wishing blessings on your week and on your conversations. Thanks for having me.